Hello, good morning students. Welcome back to our channel where we have our English class. My name is teacher Fernanda. I'm very happy and grateful to be here with you today in another class. And as you can read, today we've got reading class. I hope you're fine. I hope you're safe and sound at home. I hope your family is doing all right. So let's begin with our class. As you can read, our topic today is going to be folktales. Folktales are a kind of narrative text or orally transmitted story that goes from generation to generation. But that's a topic that we're going to check in a moment. So let's begin. What are folktales? Folktales are a kind of history that gets passed from generation to generation. True folktales do not have a single author. They develop as different people tell them over the years. Such the creations of the folk or the people. So folktales are a kind of story, yes, as here we can read, that gets transmitted from a previous generation to the next generation and so on. So, for example, fables, fairy tales, or myths or legends are kinds of folktales. Why? Because they develop as people tell them. Some things can change depending on who tells the story. For example, the Red Riding Hood. The Red Riding Hood is, well, in Spanish we know it as Caperucita Roja. So the Red Riding Hood may have developed over the years as people have told it. So for example, maybe I can say that the Riding Hood was blue, and then the story changes because I tell, for example, my students, kids, I'm going to tell you the story of the Blue Riding Hood, and then I go on and say that it's blue, and then you tell your friends that the Riding Hood was blue, and they tell their friends that the Riding Hood was blue. So it depends on how you transmit this story that it's going to be told. The details that you tell on the story, the characters, the plot, and then that way you transmit the story orally, and then some people can write or retell the story according to them. For example, in this picture here of the Red Riding Hood, we've got that it is retold by James Marshall. So James Marshall here had to retell the story as he could remember, or based on other versions of the Red Riding Hood. They are versions of the story, but they're not the same story always. Sometimes they have a little detail that can change. So that's the thing with folktales. Those are folktales. Here we have it that true folktales do not have a single author, which means that, as I said before, they are going to change depending on who tells the story, or of the person who decides to write this story, or this version of the story in this case. Many folk tales are very old. For generations, the tales were spoken aloud and never written down. Storytellers would memorize the stories and keep them alive. So previously, the folktales weren't written, they were told. So people wouldn't write the folktale, they would tell the folktale as storytellers. Storytellers are people who tell stories. They sit down and they tell you, as its name says, a story. For example, I can be a storyteller if I sit down and tell you a story. If I tell you a fairy tale or a fable or myth or a legend, yes, based in previous versions of it or based on my imagination. So a storyteller doesn't write the story. He tells it orally. He speaks the story and people listen to that story. And that was before people wrote these stories. It was the oral transmission before, and then the written tradition. Yes? So let's continue. Modern authors may write their own versions of popular kinds of traditional tales, such as fables and fairy tales. Also, folk tales that began as ancient spoken stories may now be written down in books. So the modern authors now they write their own versions of these folk tales, such as fairy tales here as Cinderella, or of traditional tales or legends or myths based on other versions or of something they listen to. And also, folktales that began as ancient spoken stories may now be written down in books. Some tales that were old and though very, very old, they began to be immortalized in a book as people started to write them. So that's how folk tales began to be written instead of verbal, of orally. Sorry. So here we've got some examples of folk tales such as the Hare and the Tortoise, and the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, because were very old tales that were first told verbally, orally to people, and then they were written. The subject. So here we're going to check what these fairy tales or these stories were about. Folk tales tell about many different parts of life. They may tell about joys and sorrows, animals and magic beings, and heroes and villains. They can be scary, funny, or exciting. Different types of folktales may entertain, teach a lesson, or try to explain things that people do not understand. So these folktales, they explain many different kinds of topics. Usually they go between extremes. They tell stories about joys, and as here we can read, joys and sorrows, yes, or about magic, animals, heroes, villains, and they can provoke many different emotions in a person. So it depends on which story we're talking about here. Different cultures tell different stories. However, some similar themes appear in folk tales told in many different places and cultures. For example, we've got the examples of tricksters. Tricksters usually were animals or beings that were somehow smart and superior in skills as other weak animals or beings. So these tricksters usually were jokers of life. So these tricksters used to make fun or take advantage of these weak animals or beings. And these trickster stories are very common to find in many different kinds of literature all over the world. So they can be found in Native American stories or even in Japanese stories. So they have some things in common. Obviously, they're not going to be exactly the same, but they're going to share the same plot, the same argument in common. Here, this one is very true. Different cultures tell different stories. So a culture from one place may not tell the same kinds of story as some other place. For example, the Mexican legends are not the same as the Greek legends or Roman legends. They differ. They are different. Then we've got the categories of folktale stories, which are the folkloric tale from oral tradition, the one you tell, the one you already tell, the fable, which is the written form of the folkloric tale, fairy tales, that are magical stories about young people meeting magical creatures, folklore in general, such as myths and legends, old wives' tale, which are stories from older women to younger women, storytelling, which is when you tell stories to other people orally as well, and performing, which is a role play or a play based in the written story or the oral story as well, but you perform that story in front of an audience as if it was a role play, as I said, or a theater play. So a fable, it's a type of folktale that teaches a lesson. Fables are usually entertaining tales featuring animals that talk and behave as people do. Because they have human-like qualities, the animals can show how foolish or wise people can be. So these animals often portray characteristics that belong to humans. So they behave as humans. They have thoughts and um, some kinds of expression that belong to humans. So these animals, they are like humans but in the bodies of animals. Often at the end of fables we have a moral of the story. Here we have some of the oldest fables came from India and Greece thousands of years ago. Many fables that are familiar in English today are said to be written in ancient Greece by a man named Aesop. So Aesop was a very prolific storyteller, and as I said before, he has a lot of credit regarding to his fables. So he wrote these fables thousands of years ago, but now they're still being told and used in plenty of educational resources or in text that we can find anywhere. For example, we've got the Three Little Pigs. Here we're going to talk about the moral of the story. So fables have a moral of the story, which means that when we finish reading this fable, we have a lesson to learn from these different situations that have to do with human values and human interpretations and actions in the world. The example here is the Three Little Pigs. The Three Little Pigs teaches that hard work is important. The house built by the hardest working pig is the one that survives from the wolves' attacks. So here we've got the moral of the story of a kind of fable. We have heard that this one is more like a tale, but I would think it's a fable actually, because it's a story with animals that portray human-like behaviors, and we've got a moral of the story at the end. So usually when we have a moral of the story at the end is more of a fable thing. It's a characteristic of a fable. We've got fairy tales. So what are fairy tales? Fairy tales are a kind of folk story about magical events and creatures. They often tell about a young person meeting fantastic beings such as fairies, witches, giants, or dragons. So fairy tales are the ones that we know in Spanish as cuentos de hadas. So these fairy tales often portray the story of a young person, usually a young woman, who meets different magical creatures such as fairies, witches, giants, dragons, and that's how the story develops. Tales with no author. Stories such as Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, and The Sleeping Beauty began as spoken folk tales with no author. So these stories, as we told before, they didn't have an author. They were told orally transmitted, and that's how they began to be known, to get known. They began to be spoken at first, but then they become written with the years. Most famous fairy tale authors. Two German brothers called the Brothers Grimm collected and wrote down many fairy tales in the 18,000s. Some modern writers, such as Hans Christian Andersen, invented their own fairy tales. For example, the Brothers Grimm, they wrote down the stories of Hansel and Gretel or the one of Rapunzel. And Hans Christian Andersen, he wrote, for example, The Little Mermaid and Snow White. He wrote those two. We've got this picture from we've got this one from the fairy tale part. which is The Little Mermaid, which we all know best for its movie. Details with no author section, for example, The Sleeping Beauty, it began with no author. It was just the folktale, the orally told story. And the most famous fairy tale authors, we've got the Brothers Grimm here, and we've got Hans Christian Andersen. And that will be all for this class. I hope you've enjoyed this class. I hope you've got a very interesting class and that you've learned something new. So thanks for your attention, and I hope you have an amazing and beautiful day.